Hello and welcome to the Tally Room live stream of the Farrer federal by-election. I'm Ben Raue. Tonight we'll be following and analysing the results of one of the most hotly anticipated by-elections that we've seen in recent years. So thank you for joining. It might take us a few minutes to get set up right now, but it is 6:30 on the East Coast. So as promised, we are starting now. This by-election, why has it been of such interest? Really, it's part of the story of the decline of the coalition and the rise of One Nation that we've seen over the last year. The Farrer is this rural seat held by Susan Lee where... Sorry, everyone. I'm just going to send the invite to my guest. We're just having a problem getting him in. So back to what we're doing. The seat of Farrer is this large rural seat. It is traditionally a safe coalition seat, although the last time we had a contest between the Liberal Party and the National Party in 2001, it was actually extremely close. Susan Lee defeated her National Party rival by about 200 votes after the retirement of Tim Fischer, who had been the leader of the National Party and Deputy Prime Minister under John Howard. And so about a quarter of the seat is the city of Albury, reasonably urban regional centre. But then the rest of the seat stretches along the Murray River to the South Australian border and is very rural. It is this seat which is a good area for One Nation. And meanwhile, Farrer is also a microcosm of what is going on with the coalition nationally. It's not just that the Liberals are losing ground to One Nation, but they're also losing ground in the cities to Independents, to Labor, to the Greens. And what's going on here is that in the city of Albury, you've seen the Liberal Party, even at the last election under Susan Lee, losing ground to Independent Michelle Milthorpe, and she did very well in that city. So we've kind of seen both effects happening in the one city. Now, in terms of what we know at the moment, we don't have any results in yet. About 47,600 pre-poll votes have been cast. It's about 1,000 more than last time, so it's about stable. It looks like maybe there'll be a few more postal votes than last time, but that's offset against the fact that there won't be absent votes because people aren't voting in other electorates. Now, at this point, I'd like to get William Bowe to join in if we can just get that working. William, I think you can hear me now. Is your camera working?
Maybe. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yep.
I don't know quite how to unmute my camera. Hang on a moment. I'll unplug it. I could go to the easy option.
That's all right. Welcome to the show, and we'll cut to you in a bit if you want to just have a look at that. What I might start by talking about is that we one of the big questions of this election, and it's something we've been seeing in a lot of seats, is where we don't know who the top two are, and there's complications due to the fact that we don't know which two candidates will be in the top, and that affects how the preference count will work. In Australian federal elections and most lower house elections in states as well, we have a two-candidate preferred count. Traditionally, it was Labor versus the coalition, but increasingly it involves another party or candidate. But importantly, almost always there's either Labor or the coalition in that two-candidate preferred count. And after the primary votes are counted tonight, the Electoral Commission workers will then move on to doing a 2CP count between those top two candidates that they think are likely to be in the top two. Doesn't mean they will be, doesn't always come off that way, but the AEC needs to make an estimate in advance of who they think that will be. And something that we're able to report as of 6 o'clock tonight is that they will be doing a 2CP between Independent and Michelle Milthorpe and One Nation's David Farley, which means the Liberal Party, the AEC is estimating it's likely they won't make the top two, and they won't be doing a Liberal Independent or Liberal One Nation count tonight. Now, I might just see, William, if you I'd be interested in your thoughts anyway, even if we can't get the camera working, about this choice to have the 2CP between the Independent and One Nation?
Well, I think it's the media consensus that they've gotten behind, and they do, factor that into account. They have an increasingly unenviable job in having to do this because, people get grumpy, they feel affronted if the assumption is that they're not going to make the final count. Of minor parties consider the entire thing an affront that represents a sort of institutional bias towards major parties. We in the election analysis community don't feel that way. We want as much information as we can get as quickly as we can get it, and this is still the best way of them cutting to the chase. I don't think too many people doubt they've picked the right candidates this time. I would point out that the Victorian Electoral Commission surprised me, and I think most of us last week, when they picked the Independent for the two-candidate count. That seemed very brave. The perception there too was that One Nation were going to make the final count, but it ended up looking like the VEC was right and that they did in fact pick the top two candidates. And I have to attribute clairvoyant powers to them because that's not what I would have done.
Yeah, and I have to admit, and this might look silly in a little while, that I was arguing that basically all the conventional wisdom that's been saying this is an Independent versus One Nation race was overblown. Not that it might not be true, but that it's stronger than what you would expect. Sorry, I'm just realizing I need to change something about my results spreadsheet to make it work. I'm just going to run that, let it run. So we have this conventional wisdom that the Liberals are going to come third. It's based on basically two UComs polls. Now, UComs do their best, but it is very hard to do seat polls, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty in that. And if the Liberals were to make the top two, I think it changes the race significantly. So I think it's probably the likeliest outcome. It's the conventional wisdom of what will happen, but I wouldn't say that it's the universally likely outcome. And I think maybe we've all been a little bit overconfident, but we'll see pretty soon as to whether that is what is going on. Now, my results spreadsheet is not currently working, but my understanding is we have got at least the first booth in. So I'm just going to load that up now. William, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it. We have one booth in.
There's two in on the primary vote and one in on two candidate preferred.
Okay, so on the primary, we've got David Farley on 56.6%, but I'm guessing these booths are very small and rural booths, so that is not a big surprise. And right now, the Independent Millthorpe's on 14.6, the Nationals 13.2, and the Liberals on 6.
Yes, so I think the dynamic that I'm a bit worried about in terms of what my system's going to do on my website projecting the results is that you're going to see there's absolutely massive One Nation primary vote swings in these early booths, which absolutely we're seeing so far. The One Nation vote in these two booths is up by 47.2%. So in these booths, One Nation got 9 to 10% last time, and now they're on 56%. My system is sort of extrapolating that 47.2% swing across the whole electorate. So this is when you sort of have these paradigm shifts, the kind of the way that we project the results by measuring the swing that's in so far and plastering that over the result from last time can be a little bit unreliable. So I think my system, and I dare say this is true of the ABC as well, is going to be too aggressive for One Nation too early. If they are indeed winning the primary vote in these sorts of booths, then this is, you don't want to speak too confidently on the basis of 295 votes, but it's consistent with the general expectation. This is going to be a big result for One Nation, but we do have to wait for some big sets.
Yeah, so I've got my result system working, which I think is a bit simpler than yours, and it's just a piece of R code that I press go and it refreshes a Google spreadsheet. But one of those two booths is Burrumbuttock, which has 211 formal votes. David Farley's on 60.7%. Now, he polled 11.65% there. That's the AEC's estimate of the historical vote last time. So it is a relatively good One Nation booth. That's like double what they got in the seat, right? They got about 5 something in the seat. And interestingly, yeah, Millthorpe is in second place, ahead of the Nationals, ahead of the Liberals. If you put the Liberals and the Nationals together, it's basically a tie. It's in fact, it's precisely a tie. The coalition collectively has 32 votes. Millthorpe has 32 votes. So that is a good sign for her in what is probably not a very good part of the electorate. The other one is Rankin Springs, 84 votes there, a smaller booth. I believe that's also the booth that has a 2CP in. Now that's got a 46.4% vote for Farley, which again is nothing to sneeze at. It's off a base of 4.4%. So that's like in a below average booth for One Nation. And they're polling, they're not polling a majority, but they're polling a very large minority. And in that booth, the Nationals have done a little bit better. So that's a good start, I think, for One Nation at this point. But it's probably worth emphasizing that we don't really have you know what? If you have any other thoughts, William, and then I might talk a little bit about like how matched booth swings work.
Yeah. All right. Still no further results than that. So the problem that you have here is that you end up having a very luxurious time talking about the first few booths that come in. They get scrutinized to within an inch of their lives because at this point in the count, they're all that's in. Whereas, in about half an hour's time, results will be flooding in and much bigger booths will be getting a lot less attention from us. So, this is a difficult time in the process from the perspective of live coverage for us, for the ABC, for anybody else. So I'll be interested to hear how you explain the science behind election result projection. I would, before you do that, I would reiterate my point that it works better when you have a certain amount of predictability from one election to the next, and which is to say that I can't think of any circumstance in which the model that we use to predict and project results is going to be more creaky than tonight, when we're seeing for one thing, Labor aren't in the count. We've got a different set of two candidate preferred candidates in the count being conducted for that. And we clearly already, even with only 295 votes, we can say for absolute certainty we're seeing a paradigm shift in the party system itself from one election to the next. That makes it a lot harder to compare apples with apples and, project that apple-related projection over the whole electorate. And I suspect that my system is going to be calling the result for One Nation earlier than I'd like it to be. I also suspect that come the end of the evening, everyone will be saying, "Oh, wasn't that clever of you to call the results so quickly?" Because One Nation did indeed end up winning, but it shouldn't be. I don't think I should be on 81% chance of One Nation, which is what my system's saying at the moment. With 300 votes.
I should pull your election system up as well. So if people do want to look at election results, obviously there's the ABC, which, we're big fans of that. But William's election results website, which we used a lot in the South Australian state election, is also really good because it gives you those primary vote figures yourself, and it also has estimates and all that stuff. So big fan of that. But yeah, to explain a little bit about the weaknesses here, because there's a couple of things going on. So the basics of matched swing, which is how, the ABC's computer works, the way your computer works. I usually only bother doing it for little by-elections where I can usually data enter myself. But the basic principles are the same, is that you have a baseline that you're comparing the results to. That you're not just comparing the raw numbers right now to the final numbers last time, because they're not like with like. As we're seeing right now, rural booths tend to come in earlier. That wasn't always the case, but according to the way the AEC currently conducts its elections, rural booths come in first. They tend to be more rural. Results have a rural bias, and the political parties that do better in rural areas. And so, but if you are comparing like with like, you can say this was the result last time in this booth, this is the result this time. Is there a change? So yes, this booth might look like a better coalition booth than the overall last time, but actually it's a 3% swing against them. And that works pretty well when you have some stability compared to last time, as you said, particularly when you have the same candidates in the 2CP. And we don't this time. I have attempted to come up with a number, but it's basically a slight adjustment to the Liberal versus Independent 2CP from last time. So it's going to give us a sense of whether Millthorpe is outperforming how she performed last time, but it's not going to be it's not really going to, like, you would expect that maybe One Nation does relatively better in some areas and the Liberals would have done relatively better in others. So the idea here is that we can match these and then that can give us a comparison, but we don't have a match on the 2CP, and on the primary vote it's difficult too, because, for example, there's about 9% of the electorate that voted Labor last time and that's disappeared. So you would expect parties of the left to do better just because of Labor's absence. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily gaining votes from the right. And so, yes, it's useful, it's interesting. We're going to be talking about swings as they happen during the night. We're going to be talking about what happened last time. But I think we're going to have to be cautious. I think it's funny when you talk about needing to be careful and then confidently saying that there's never been an election as difficult to predict as this one, or whatever it was you said in terms of something like that, because it probably is true, but these things keep happening, so I think it may not be true for very long. So I think, this will be difficult. I think people who are paying attention to what we do in analysis will have heard that a lot. Like, we've been saying that a lot. This stuff's happening more and more, and I think it is just a structural change in the political system in Australia that's making, the techniques that were so effective in a two-party system, we're not throwing them out, but they don't quite achieve the same goals as they used to.
Yeah, I think, well, I hope that once One Nation are kind of bedded in, that we will get a bit of stability. And at the moment, we're in a kind of changeover period from one party system to another. On the other hand, it may be what's happening now is just a new volatility, and we're not going to be able to get a firm grip on what the party system looks like in future. And the days of reliably being able to model one election result on the last are going to be something that we look back on in fondness in the strange new world that we're in. We've got another booth in. We've got 4 booths in now, actually. So on the primary vote and 2 in on 2 candidate preferred. Borellan with 288 votes is in, and Bunbury. So I'm taxing my knowledge of the wilds of New South Wales here. Burrabuttock is not far from Albury, so maybe that's particularly of interest. Bunbury isn't either. I think they're quite far from Albury culturally, if not geographically, though.
Yeah.
Burrabuttock is a 74% One Nation result, and 60.7% One Nation. So I think what I just said about the cultural differences, once you're beyond the town limits, then voting behaviour changes quite dramatically.
So can I run through some of these numbers here for these booths? Borellan, 48% for One Nation, Millthorpe's in second on 19, 12.5 for the Nationals. And 6.6 for the Liberals. Maybe at some point we should talk about the Liberal National contest between the two coalition partners too. And then in Walbundry, it looks pretty similar. One Nation 56, Millthorpe second on 15, Nationals 12. Liberals second on 15, Nationals 11, and Millthorpe on 12.6. One scenario that I've been thinking about that would be consistent with this, which is that as I've been looking at these results, I've been like, it feels like this is probably going to be a Liberal versus Independent contest in Albury and a coalition versus One Nation contest in the rural parts of the electorate. It doesn't mean that there won't be any One Nation voters in Albury or Millthorpe voters in the rural areas, but in terms of who's in the top. And so if that's true and the coalition is competitive, because at this point we'll talk about the Nats versus the Libs in a minute, but you would expect the coalition to have a decent amount of preference flows between them, and they're effectively could be treated as a unit to analyse. If the coalition is competitive in both of those, then they're probably winning, because they're probably, if they're neck and neck with One Nation in rural bits and they're neck and neck with Millthorpe in Albury, then they're probably winning. But what this is showing us is it's not telling us anything about Albury, it's not telling us anything about Millthorpe's base, but it's telling us that in these rural areas, One Nation is very comfortably beating the coalition to the point where, like, this is not going to put the coalition to the 2CP, even if they did a bit better in Albury. I mean, over the four booths we have so far, Millthorpe's on 16, the combined coalition votes on 20.7. And these are far from Millthorpe's best areas.
Yeah, and as you say, we've got. I'm sure it's oversimplifying it to say it's an election of two parts, but I think you have broadly identified the point that until you get Albury, you don't know exactly how well Michelle Millthorpe is doing. You don't all really know how the coalition parties are doing relatively to each other. Like Nationals are ahead at the moment of the Liberals, but then that stands to reason because we're seeing, deep rural booths in. And I will still be surprised if the Nationals end up ahead of the Liberals. And, the general consensus was that they wouldn't. So, for the time being, I think, you just have to add Liberal and Nationals together. If anyone's looking at my site, I'm currently projecting that the Liberal Party will end up with no votes at all. That's a problem that you get, as I say, when you have the Liberal vote down by 45%. In the booths that are in, the Liberal Party have gone from 53% to 8%. And, I've extrapolated that over the course of the entire result, and that leaves them with nothing. So I need a bit more ballast on these results to be able to project anything. All you can say so far really is that things are going according to script for One Nation, and they're on over 50%. These are going to be their best booths, but they're going to be getting preferences from the Liberals and the Nationals. Michelle Millthorpe will have to do very well in Albury. You could respond that that's been true all along, so it doesn't tell us anything we didn't know already. But so far, it's been going according to script for One Nation.
I was going to suggest we talk about Liberals and Nationals, and while I'm loading this up, I might briefly say that it's also worth noting we don't have a match swing between the Liberals and the Nationals because we don't know how many of those people who were voting Liberal in the past actually were more comfortable as National Party voters. Now, apparently we've got
the Liberals have got their nose ahead of the Nationals. Well, I would explain a lot if it was, because now I'm no longer giving
Heights. Yeah.
So that's made my system more less perverse. I'm now projecting a non-zero result for the Liberals. It's at the very northern outskirts of Albury, but it's still very much identifiably, an urban rather than a rural booth. And what we've got here is Michelle Millthorpe is on 31%. This results in this specific booth looks a bit like the result that was in the opinion poll that Michelle Millthorpe's camp were putting out, which had both the Independent and One Nation both on a fraction over 30%. And my take from that was, well, Millthorpe needs to do better than that.
Yeah.
The One Nation candidate is going to get most of the preferences because most of the preferences are going to be from Liberal and National. So if we've got one booth in from Albury, One Nation are ahead of Michelle Millthorpe in that booth. If Millthorpe isn't winning booths on the primary vote in Albury, then she's not going to win. And admittedly, it's only one booth. It's 423 votes. Maybe the more you get to the sort of centre of Albury, the better it will be for her.
Yeah.
But, I do make that point that she needs to win booths solidly in Albury, and she's not winning that one.
Yeah, so if I can jump in there. So just to go through the numbers a bit more specifically, Farley's on 34.5%, Millthorpe's on 31.9%, the Nationals are on 3%. It's about 14.5% for the combined coalition vote. Compared to last time, at least the AEC's estimate of last time, 26.6% for the Liberals, 25.8% for Millthorpe, 8% for One Nation, about 20% left over. I think some of that would have gone to Palmer, but most of it would have gone to Labor. But I don't have that number in front of me. So this is only a slight increase in a primary vote for Millthorpe, even though the Liberal vote has completely crashed. I don't think it's a very good sign for the independent, to be honest, because the other thing to note is if we're talking about a campaign of two halves, they're not equal halves. You know, Albury is about 30% of the electorate. So if the question is Millthorpe wins Albury, One Nation wins the regions, for Millthorpe to win the electorate, she's got to run up the score in Albury more. And right now, this booth, admittedly, again, probably not the best part of. It's not a very big booth. It's 423 votes. It's not very big for a kind of urban electorate, urban booth. So I think she probably will have better booths to come, but it's not a good sign. I think right now, One Nation are looking reasonably strong, like the kind of most credible party here, I think.
Yeah, I can't really, add anything to that at this stage. It's good that we've got an Albury booth in. Things are starting to pick up now. We've got 9 booths in, 2 in on the TCP. Are any more of the booths in from Albury? I'll have a look at my map. No, they're not. So yeah, I suspect that we're probably a bit lucky to get an early Albury booth in. I think we're going to be sort of waiting on big results will come in at 8 to 9 o'clock from Albury, maybe 9 to 10 to the pre-poll booths.
Yeah.
And you always have to be a little bit circumspect until you get, if you see that the kind of booth that has a lot of voters at it has a different dynamic from all the many small ones, which we're seeing coming in at the moment from rural areas. But again,
now can I talk about what else we've got? Right now we have 10 booths reporting primary votes. We've got 2 booths reporting the preference count. So the number of booths reporting primary votes is starting to go up, but they're all pretty small. I can't see any of them that are over 500. The biggest are in the kind of low 400s, but we're starting to get a decent number of them. But they are all, except for Springfield, they are all in the rural parts of the electorate. We've got one way up in the north on the edge of the seat. Like there's, they're all pretty distant from the. Yeah. Oh, we actually have one more that's on the very outskirts. This is the one I think Garoggery you were talking about, which is probably not particularly culturally linked to Albury, but is quite close to Albury. And again, it looks like all the others, 52% One Nation vote. So that rural vote is coming in reasonably confidently.
Yeah, I was referring to Burrumbuttock, but it's really a similar booth to Burrumbuttock. It's the sort of
it's right down the road
from that. Yeah, so that's you're going to see the same sort of dynamic there. There's a booth in from Leeton, which is one of the largest centres, without being on the Albury scale, and it's a little bit more modest for the One Nation than the very small rural booths. But even so, they're on 40% of the vote there.
Interestingly, not very good for the coalition. Like Millthorpe is picking it up rather than One Nation. So I think at this point, I mean,
that's not a bad result for Millthorpe. That booth, she's up 12.1%. But I suspect if I had a benchmark for her for that sort of booth, she'd still want to be doing better than that. The One Nation nearly doubling her even in the sort of larger towns. So, again, I don't want to write her off until we start seeing solid Albury booths in. But, if you were writing a script for One Nation to win, then, it would be following what we're seeing so far.
And you'd have to say at this point that the AEST's decision to do an independent versus One Nation count seems like the right one. It does.
It does, and it would have been folly for them not to have. Whereas, like I said, I do have to take my hat off to the Victorian Electoral Commission for getting it right last week. That was very fine work, and not what I would have done. Having said that, I don't want to get bogged down on the Nepean by-election, but it's going to be close who comes second there. But that they did well in having a modest sense of how One Nation were going to do at that by-election. One Nation probably had a bit of a disappointing result there. They have been putting a lot more resources into this by-election than they did in Nepean. I don't think that they really were all that engaged with Nepean, whereas this by-election, for all that the campaign has not gone well for them, it has been, they've clearly regarded this as a showpiece event for the emergence of One Nation, and they've put out all stops. And so far, at least, it's paying off for them.
I think I should probably give a bit of an update of where we're at as we've passed 7 o'clock, just to give you a sense of where we're at. I'm joined by William Bowe, from the cephalogist from the Pole Bludger. Fortunately, we can't get the camera working, so he's a caller in at the moment. But we are having an interesting conversation here. Basically, where we're at is the Electoral Commission has decided to do a count between One Nation and the Independent, Michelle Millthorpe. Right now, that is looking like the right decision. We have quite a few rural booths from all over the electorate that are reporting, small rural booths. They are all reporting very high votes for One Nation, often over 50%, at the very least in the 40s. We have one booth on the outskirts of Albury, and it is showing Independent Michelle Millthorpe and One Nation's David Farley neck and neck on primary votes. But that's probably not very good news for Millthorpe, because Albury makes up a smaller part of the electorate, and for her to win, she probably needs to be polling a lot better in Albury than Farley is doing in his heartland, which is the kind of rest of the electorate. It's also probably worth noting as well that I'm assuming that we will see, now that we know that the Liberals and the Nationals aren't going to be making the 2CP, it's looking like that was the right call by the Commission to not include the Liberals or the Nationals in the preference count. Those preferences are going to favour One Nation. So last time around, we had the Labor Party polling 9% of the vote. Admittedly, we've got the Greens, but there are more... Outside of One Nation and the Independent, there's more votes available to be distributed as preferences on the right than on the left. So if this race was to be 50-50 on primary votes, that's not good news for Millthorpe, I would think. So like a booth like that one in it was Springfield Heights in the northern outskirts of Albury, probably is going to be producing a small lead for One Nation on the 2CP.
One sort of thing that I would point out, we've only got 2 booths in on the TCP count. The preferences are a little more thought than I might have figured. Out of the preferences that are being distributed from those 2 booths, One Nation are getting 55% of them, and the Independents getting 45% of them. And most of these are National and Liberal votes. So I would have thought on that basis that, 70% of National and Liberal preferences would be going to One Nation ahead of the Independent. And we're not talking many votes here. There's 424 votes out of the 2 booths that are in on the TCP count. But like I said, I would have expected maybe a 70-30 split in favour of One Nation from these booths. Maybe we're seeing better preference flows to Millthorpe than would have been anticipated relative to One Nation. Again, I have to stress that we're only talking about 2 booths here. We're pretty well along with the primary vote count. We've got 4,400 votes in. We've got 13 booths. That's pretty solid. It's 3.5% of the enrolment. It's not too much. But when you actually only look at the booths that have the TCP, and you are dealing in small numbers,
and they're rural, right?
Like there's a third booth in now.
It's worth emphasising.
Yeah,
sorry, William.
She's
can I jump in?
Doing less badly on preferences than I would have thought.
Can I jump in there? Yeah. So we've only got 3. When we talk about preference flows, we're talking about the 3 booths where we have preference counts. The third one, Euston, I think it's another of these small rural booths. But it is interesting that whoever is left still voting for Liberals, the Nationals, as well as the other voters, but in most of these, there's not many others, to be honest. They are only slightly favouring One Nation. I think it probably does reflect that the kind of voter who is voting for One Nation over the Liberal Party is sorry, let me restart that. We've just had a technical problem with William, which was slightly distracting, but I'll get him back on in a minute. The kind of voter who is still voting Liberal and National, who didn't decide to switch to One Nation, is probably less conservative than those who have been left behind. So I would, in that sense, maybe that is reflecting that. Hello, William, and we can see you now.
I got kicked out there, and now that I'm back on, this is working, and it looks like I'm sitting in a dungeon.
I'll turn the light
While
on
you
so
were
I
off
get
the
enough.
call, William, while you're
I
off the
heard
call,
you.
I
I
was
heard you.
okay. Great, go ahead.
I don't know if I was absorbing it. um,
Yeah, it was basically saying that the it's not random which Liberal and National voters have left the Liberal and National voter bloc, right?
yeah,
They're
if you're
more
talking about
likely to be
preference
the
flows,
right-leaning ones.
yeah, that's a good point. I suspect that what we're seeing here is that I've heard people were sort of throwing this theory at me a little bit at the South Australian election as well, and it didn't actually end up playing out that way. But it could be that it is playing out this way now. That the very voters that are moving from the coalition to One Nation are the most right wing ones. Therefore, forgive me if I'm simply restating what you just said. The voters that are remaining with the Liberal and National voters are of a more kind of moderate disposition,
Yeah.
and therefore that preference flow is going to be less One Nation friendly than it had been in the past. And that could explain my surprise that I'm seeing a sort of 55-45 preference flow compared with the sort of 70-31 that I was expecting. Is that enough to put Michelle Milthorpe in the game? It's enough to make me reiterate my kind of warning that until we see big boos in from Albury, we don't want to be too hasty to call the results,
Yep.
even when you're looking at raw votes with One Nation on 48%, where I imagine 30% will be a winning One Nation primary vote. Maybe that weak flow of preferences means it's more like 34 and 35%. But at the moment that's where they are. But again, we have to keep reiterating that we've got a sample of boos that is heavily skewed towards rural areas, and that always makes these seats difficult to call early.
There was just a bit of feedback about our volumes being at different levels. I think it's that mine was a bit lower, so I've just adjusted it. But please let me know if that's made it better or worse. I was just posting there a comment from someone talking about there being discussion on the ABC about this decision to preference One Nation. The thing is, I think sometimes these get interpreted as these preferencing decisions as actually shifting how people are going to preference, which maybe it does to a few people. But I think, to be honest, it just reflects the reality that the coalition voter base are more sympathetic to One Nation than the independent. That they're in a position where they would expect their voters, or their voters, but also the voters that they are worried about losing to One Nation, to be more sympathetic to One Nation. And I think it does reflect the polarization we have. That again, I don't think the coalition had a lot of options. Like, I think probably this was the only option they had in front of them. So I don't think it's necessarily, you can take this preferencing decision as indicating that the Liberals were, making some big shift that was going to change how their voters voted, as much as reflecting the way their voters were already going.
Having said that, though, non-trivial numbers of major party voters do indeed follow the how to vote card, which I think makes it all the more interesting that we're not seeing a preference flow as skewed towards One Nation as that. In fact, the more votes come in, the more balanced it looks. I've now got 51.2% of preferences going to One Nation, by which I mean preferences from absolutely everyone other than One Nation and the independent candidate. What I'm doing here is I'm looking at the boos that have reported their two candidate results, and I am calculating the number of votes that are in that TCP result that are not those candidates' primary votes. And it's very even at the moment. It's 358 to 341. Having said that, my win probability for One Nation is now up to 92.4, but I have to stress that I'm less confident about that than I normally would be. But I've been looking at a lot of ballot paper data for the Senate to sort of ascertain the proportions of voters who exactly follow what the how to vote card says. It's only in the Senate that you can do that at federal level. You don't get ballot paper data for the lower house. But on Senate on how to vote cards, major party how to vote cards, it will tell you which 6 parties you should number. And from that, we can count exactly how many people are dutifully doing exactly what the major party how to vote cards are telling them. And it's in the order of 30 to 40%. So how many people of those people would be voting for One Nation even if the how to vote card wasn't telling them to? Probably most of them. But even so, it's not trivial. It's enough for me to be genuinely surprised that based on what we're seeing so far, preferences are splitting pretty evenly, and that at least is one sort of surprise to emerge from the count so far, at least so far as I'm concerned. Quite a few coalition voters, it seems, are not following the how to vote card and are favouring Millthorpe over One Nation.
Now, I might just share my screen and actually go to your website, if that's all right, William, and we can talk a little bit about what the figures say. Now, a bit of feedback I got was that I was scrolling around a little bit too fast last time, so I'm going to try not to do that very much. But we're just looking at the totals here, and I'll use a different tab to look at the individual booths. We now have 10 booths reporting 2CP, and so that raw number of preferences to independent or One Nation is getting a lot bigger. The total volume is not huge. It's about 2,500 votes in the preference count now. But I think it's showing a pretty clear trend for rural areas, which is most of these booths are rural, and One Nation is winning those very comfortably. But we do also have a 2CP figure for the booth of Springdale Heights. So if I'll just go down to that for a second. Springdale Heights, and that is, if you, for those of you who have joined us a little bit later, this is the only booth we've gotten in so far from the city of Albury. And you normally expect the rural booths to come in first. We're expecting a very different voting trend in Albury compared to the rest of the electorate. In the rest of the electorate, Farley is winning very comfortably, well over 60% in most booths. But Springdale Heights, Millthorpe is winning, but only by 7 votes, 215 to 208, which fits with what I said earlier, which is maybe this would be a very narrow lead for Millthorpe. So even in, the one urban booth we have so far, admittedly a small outer urban booth, it's not a very good booth for Millthorpe, and it's probably not as good a booth for Millthorpe as the more inner urban Albury booths, but right now we're not seeing any trend that Millthorpe is winning big in Albury that might be offsetting the big wins for One Nation.
I've just pulled up the result from the 2025 election for Springdale Heights. She won that booth on 2 candidate preferred over Susan Lee by 57.7 to 42.3, and she's only won it this time by 51.49. So that doesn't bode well for her if she's not winning booths in Albury as well as she won them last year.
Okay, so just to clarify that, so that is she's about 2% worse on the 2CP in this booth than she was.
More like 5 or 6.
Oh, sorry,
we've gone from sort of 58.42 to 51.49.
Okay, right, yeah.
So that's not an encouraging result when you look at it like that for Millthorpe.
Yeah, which is consistent with the idea that Millthorpe may end up with a worse margin than she had last time, which was 6.2% overall in the whole seat.
Yeah, well, again, I have to be a broken record. We dearly love to see more booths in from Albury, and we've only got that one, so we've been harping on pretty heavily about that booth. We're getting quite a few booths in now from Griffith and Leeton, which are, larger centres. They're still, rural communities. So, but Millthorpe has won one booth in Griffith on the primary vote, which I'm perhaps mildly surprised by. So she's done well in the Griffith West booth. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the primary votes, the other booths in those towns are favouring One Nation. In some cases very heavily.
So, yeah, she's. I could kind of get overexcited from her perspective about Griffith West. I've got sort of 4 booths in that are from in and around Griffith, another 3 that are from in and around Leeton. One Nation are outpolling her in all but one of them. But yeah,
Yeah.
there's at least one good result for her there. Her primary vote seems to be up pretty solidly in these booths by about 10%. But you compare that with what One Nation are doing, they've gone from sort of 10% in these booths to 50%. And yeah, you end up going back to the point that, she's going to have. We've got a new booth in from Albury now. The Glenroy booth is in from Albury. And Millthorpe is on 34.8% and Farley is on 30.4%. That's not bad for Millthorpe, but I suspect that if you were plotting this out ahead, she'd need to be
Yeah.
winning Albury booths by more than that.
So that's 35% primary. In Glenroy, that is a swing to her of 8%. But, there's no Labor candidate this time. And so I think probably that's about net neutral. Like not really achieving much, maybe even going backwards. Yeah, I think right now One Nation is looking very strong. They've clearly dominant in the rural parts of the seat. I mean, at this point, overall, if we look at those totals there, the Liberals are on 9.6%, the Nationals are on 10.3%. Probably when the more urban parts of the electorate come in, the Liberals will probably take a lead, but they are well behind the Independent, well out of the race, and One Nation has like one rural Farah quite comfortably, and we just don't know what we're going to see from Albury. What do you think you would need to see? And you won't be around on the show for that much longer. In terms of when we actually call this thing, what we're missing that is preventing us from calling it for One Nation right now.
Well, for what it's worth, my results system is calling it for One Nation,
noticed,
but
yeah.
I've been stressing all along that I thought it was going to go too hard too early for One Nation. So, that's computer says no sort of thing rather than me being ready to call it quite yet. Look, I think if we get another 2 or 3 booths in from Albury and they show Millthorpe only a little bit ahead of One Nation or not ahead of One Nation at all, then I'll be, feeling more confident in what my computer is telling me. But, certainly we're seeing more and more TCP results in some of these rural booths. One of them, One Nation have won 89 to 11 in percentage terms. Another one went 80-20. Those are the best results for them. So when you're seeing those sorts of results, I think she's going to need to win 60-40 in Albury just, to pluck some vaguely impressionistic numbers, which I haven't crunched too carefully.
I think she's going to need more than that.
Unless
though.
we start seeing booths where, what do you know, Michelle Millthorpe is actually winning some of these booths 60-40 on the TCP in Albury, then I might start to give her a little bit more of a chance. But as you say, we've got 2 booths in from Albury now. One of them is not quite, maybe they're not representative. Neither of them's from the very core of Albury, but nonetheless, they are both booths where, she'd need to win pretty solidly, and one of them she won just barely. And I think that's probably going to be the case of the second booth as well when it comes in on the TCP. The Glenroy booth, she won at the election sort of 56-44. So the 2 booths that are in from Albury had similar results in TCP terms at the last election. She won both of them about 57-43. And I think in both of them, she's going to have more narrow wins this time. And in order to win this election, she needs bigger ones. So unless we start seeing some surprises, some really different results from Albury coming in with the next few booths that are coming in, then I would be ready to call it for One Nation pretty soon, I think.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I mean, that Glenroy booth, adds to my confidence. I think maybe one or two more primary booths that look similar to that, or getting Glenroy 2CP in and looking very weak for Millthorpe, and I think we probably will be ready to call it, I suspect, before 8 o'clock tonight. Something else I want to ask you about, though, is postal and pre-poll votes, because Millthorpe won the election day booths in Albury, but I don't think she did anywhere near as well in pre-poll. In fact, I can look up, if people are interested, my guide to Farah breaks down treats the pre-poll votes separately. And the Liberals won 56.2% on the pre-poll. They won the other votes even more comfortably. They often do better, but both Independent and One Nation, you'd think they're both kind of weak on the those other special votes, which last time made up over 50% of the vote. Looks like that's going to happen again. It looks like roughly even proportions this time as last time, maybe more if you factor in the fact that the turnout is probably down a bit. So I don't know what that picture looks like with the pre-poll, the postal votes. We're going to get most of the pre-poll in tonight, I believe, but it'll be much later. Postal votes, some will be counted tonight. What are your thoughts on the role they'll play?
Well, it's one thing that I haven't got my head around in the brave new world that we're in that postal votes have always been very reliably conservative. Does that transfer over to One Nation? Generally speaking, particularly in rural booths, a lot of the postal vote especially is from people who are too far away from a voting centre, farmers, and those votes are really conservative and have reliably been since the year dot. In the world that we're used to, the coalition versus Labor world, I imagine that will transfer over to One Nation. I'm not sure how it would transfer over in a contest where you've got One Nation versus a coalition candidate or One Nation versus an independent candidate. So I imagine where it's One Nation versus Labor, then I think you can be pretty reliably able to say that postals are going to heavily favour One Nation. Is it a different story when it's One Nation against somebody else? This is probably something I ought to have studied more carefully after the South Australian election.
Yeah.
But so that's a bit of a wild card maybe. The postal votes maybe don't amount to all that much these days, certainly compared to what early votes amount to. You always have to raise at that point of qualification early in the night on election night these days. You could very well see a different dynamic on pre-polls. They always come in later because there's so many more of them at any given voting centre. What we're seeing now is we're seeing ordinary election day polling booths that only had a couple of hundred votes cast at them. Quick to count, they report at 6:30, 7:30. The big pre-polling centres, particularly in Albury, might have 10,000 votes at them, and they will come in a lot later in the evening. And there have been occasions where these votes can sometimes come in at 11 o'clock. If there's a different dynamic in them, you end up with a different result to what the TV networks were talking about all throughout the night. Not to a radically different extent, but I can think of a few elections, 2018 Victoria, the Wentworth by-election. Both of those were elections where the Liberal Party ended up doing less badly than people thought they were doing at this time of the night. So you always have to add that qualification. It could be that there's the kind of person who votes at a pre-poll voting centre is going to be a more favourable kind of voter for Michelle Millthorpe. And
now, can I jump in here,
yeah.
William? Looking at your results map, I can see that we have a couple of extra booths in Albury that look a little bit better for Michelle Millthorpe. Probably not enough to be winning the seat, but the booth of Hume, which is sort of northern suburbs of Albury, but much closer than the booth we were talking about earlier, Springdale. We've got primary votes from there, which has Millthorpe on 36, Farley on 30. Again, kind of similar. Albury East, though, is a lot stronger. Millthorpe on 40.7, Farley on 23.8. But by that point, it's not even the whole of Albury, right? You're getting into kind of inner city Albury. And you know what? Like, I think probably Millthorpe will run up the score there, but I don't think it's going to be enough to offset those big One Nation margins in the majority of the electorate.
That's my feeling. Albury East does look like a good result for her on its face. Having said that, her primary vote's only up 4.6%. So she's got 40.7% there, which is a good result. But it's not the size of the swing that we were thinking she would need. Extrapolate that kind of 55-45 preference split we're seeing onto these sorts of results, and I'm not quite sure what you get here. She would be winning a booth like Albury East, I suppose, by sort of 60-40 maybe, which is where we were thinking she would have to be. But now, that's her sort of best result. I would
looking up Albury East from 2025. Admittedly, sometimes these numbers change a bit because extra booths get added or abolished or something. She got 61% of the 2CP in Albury East. So she should be winning Albury East comfortably.
Yeah, I think she's doing about that well this time. And this is the best result probably we've been able to pick out for her. She's holding her ground. She doesn't need to hold her ground. She needs to pick up by 6%.
Yep. And she's up 4 points on the primary vote, but there was a 10% vote for Labor last time. And that Labor vote would have favoured her substantially. So losing that vote and only replacing 40% of it, okay, some of those might have gone to the Greens or something, but I don't think that's the story here. I think, to be honest, right now, those Albury numbers are starting to look like a result that is weaker for Millthorpe than she had against Susan Lee in 2025.
Yeah, and I dare say that that's true in the rural areas as well. To what extent I haven't quite wrapped my head around, but based on the information we're seeing at the moment, we're probably looking at a sort of 60-40 One Nation win, and I'll throw caution into the wind. I'm ready to call it at this point.
Yeah, I think I am too. Well, you're going to leave us in a minute, William.
Go back to your that gave me
live blog, but I think we can probably say at this point that One Nation has won the Farrer by-election.
My apologies to your subsequent guests for stealing their thunder like that.
But we'll have lots to talk about as the figures come in as we look at the shape of this. But right now, it's not looking like a close result. It's looking like maybe close, slight Millthorpe edge in Albury, but offset against, in the rest of the electorate, a very large rural majority for One Nation. And so probably quite a comfortable One Nation majority is where this electorate is looking right now. And we'll talk more about that in the next hour. I'll have another guest on soon, but I have plenty to talk about right now. But I'm going to put that up on the screen that we are calling the result for One Nation. Was there anything else you wanted to say before you head off? And if you do want to follow what William's saying, what William's analysis is, you'll be updating your live blog as a text thing for the rest of the night.
Yes, I very much need to get stuck into that. So it's been a pleasure being here. I don't have anything further to add that immediately springs to mind. I'm sure I will the moment I hit the hang up button. But if anyone is interested in any of my further thoughts, polbludget.net.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us
pleasure.
Tonight, William. So I'm gonna just pause for a second here while I pull up some figures, and then I'll have some more thoughts on this. And there's a question there that I wanted to address as well. Sorry, just a second. We will have another guest on shortly, and I think Phoebe is in the waiting room, so we'll call her in, and then I've got a couple of things that we can jump into then. Hello, Phoebe. Welcome.
Hey, how you going?
Welcome to the show,
Ben. How are you?
Good.
Hi, good to be here. How I've been staying tuned. It looks like you've just called it, I believe.
Yeah, so it happened a little bit earlier than we thought, but it is looking pretty clear at this point. We're starting to get these Albury numbers in. Probably I might introduce you, Phoebe, and then we'll give you a bit of an update of where things are at 7:30. Phoebe is a political scientist and right now is one of the editors of this special edition of the Australian Journal of Political Science about minor parties and independence. So this has come maybe not quite so timely because it's come a little bit late, but it's really showing that the story of minor parties continues to be a very big factor in Australian politics. So welcome to the show.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really kind of a fruition a lot of the trends that we've seen develop previous years. I've found it really interesting watching this evening. I've been thinking quite a bit about what this looks like in terms of ruled the regions.
Yeah. Sorry, Phoebe, you're breaking up a little bit. I don't know if there's anything you can do for your internet to there, but we're a bit struggling to hear what you're saying. Yeah. I might just talk about a couple of points just while if you can see if there's anything you can do there. There was a question from someone talking about, does this, I'll just show it up on the screen here, does this page actually weight by booth so the swing is more indicative? We were talking about this earlier. William's system as well as my own system do use match booth swing. We are attempting to match the results this election to what happened last time, but it's very hard to do that because we don't have comparable figures for 2025 and so much has changed. We don't have a Labor candidate. We've got the Nationals and the Liberals competing, which they didn't do before, and we've got this huge One Nation vote. So we are making comparisons to previous elections, and the system is taking that into account. And of course, we are taking account of the fact that the areas that have come in are biased towards One Nation. But I think we're at the point now where the One Nation lead in those rural areas is big enough that any kind of Millthorpe lead in Albury probably can't offset it.
Yes, I would say so. It's hoping my connection's working a bit better now, Ben. I've
that's
changed
better.
Internet. Yeah, yep, great. Apologies for that. Yes, so it's definitely looking like Albury is not coming in as strong as Millthorpe would need to, but I think it's also showing perhaps some shortcomings of the campaign. It really did focus its efforts, I would say, on Albury, but perhaps has gotten the issues wrong and over-relied on what was maybe last time around more of a vote against Susan Ley or the Liberal Party than it was actually a vote for Michelle Millthorpe herself.
And your expertise is on a bunch of stuff, but part of it is around like campaigns that are run by independents. And I mean, if you're saying there that this campaign was very focused on Albury, from a strategic practicality perspective, that kind of makes sense. But this is not the electorate's name is not Albury, right? Like it's much bigger than Albury. It covers this vast rest of the electorate. And she was already winning in Albury before this election, right? So that seems like maybe a bit of a, I don't know if it's an error, but a weakness in the campaign at least. Maybe one they're aware of, but certainly a weakness.
Yeah, I mean, I think looking through the campaign and sort of the major policies that Millthorpe tried to foreground throughout it, you see she started in Albury. She did try and build out from there. So there was some real forays into like and into Griffith in particular. So she did make some real efforts in some of the kind of regional hubs or towns. And there was a lot of effort in setting up kind of campaign events or hubs, various things throughout the kind of population centres. So they were trying to work outwards. I think it just obviously has not worked, and there was an over-reliance perhaps on that Albury base. Yeah.
So just to check the numbers and give a bit of an update for anyone who's just joining, we're still kind of waiting for more figures from Albury. Millthorpe does have one good booth in Albury East, but most of the figures we're getting are still for these rural booths. We've got 30 booths reporting preference flows, but 29 of them are outside of Albury. So right now, it seems like we have a much better picture of what's going on in those rural areas. I don't know how aware you were of the One Nation campaign, but one of the things I'm curious about is how much, we've seen this big defection of Liberal national voters to One Nation, and we've also seen politicians like Corey Bernardi and Barnaby Joyce jump over to One Nation. But whether this also reflects activists and supporters on the ground, that in a lot of these small rural towns, if you don't have the base in the electorate, it's in that local community, it's very hard to compete. And if a lot of those kind of National Party, Liberal Party supporters in those areas have jumped over to One Nation, that would have made a big difference in their campaign.
Yeah, I think so. And look, it's always tricky to see what happens on the ground when you're sitting outside an electorate. It's absolutely certain. But it has seemed, even from where I've been sitting, looking at things on social media online, you are seeing a lot of One Nation volunteers. So historically, the party has really struggled to mobilise supporters in that way. They are often seen as a party of kind of disaffected or disengaged voters, which are not the kind of people who get out and knock on doors or hand out how to vote cards traditionally, right? So the idea that there are many, many people who are donning orange T-shirts, sticking on a cap and heading out to talk to their neighbours perhaps is a really big shift, I think. It was interesting watching Karl Stefanovic's debate last night, in which you had a huge One Nation presence in the crowd. Obviously, you had people like Pauline Hanson in the electorate for the election, but you also had a lot of people who appeared to be on the ground volunteers.
Well, you mentioned orange. There was a big part of the election, the conversation around the election, which I found a bit baffling, which was specifically around the colours that the candidates used. There was a lot of focus on presenting Michelle Milthorpe as a teal, that the word teal, which I think it's by its very nature very vague, unspecific. It does kind of make sense sometimes to talk about it generically when you're talking about like teal areas in the cities. But I think when you get into rural areas, it becomes less useful. It's obviously something that the independents in rural areas don't identify by, but it became a thing where almost trying to present it, and you would see it from Sky News and people on the right, almost trying to present it as some kind of scandal or something nefarious to be using the colour orange instead of the colour teal, even though I actually think probably the history shows that that is the historical option for these kinds of independents, that's what they've run under.
Absolutely. And I think in this, Milthorpe was borrowing from Indi. This was Kathy McGowan's chosen colour. She had orange cockatoos. Milthorpe went with orange emus. So there is a real tradition here that is separate to the One Nation tradition with this colour. And it's also notably the colour that she ran under in 2025's federal election. So I can't see a scenario in which she would have changed. And obviously embracing teal as a colour, teal as a logo would have probably been to her detriment. I would generally agree with your take on the term as a whole. I think it speaks to their stance on policy, particularly when you are thinking of urban centre kind of teals. So perhaps Wentworth, Mackellar, these sorts of electorates, where it does actually speak to what they stand for. Once you start looking at the community independents or the voices-backed independents in regional areas, that's not really their policy platform. So it's not actually capturing much about them. You're better off talking about them as, I think, community independents, or perhaps referring specifically to the fact that they had Climate 200 support. It is also probably worth noting that Milthorpe was also relying on the Regional Independence Fund for this, though.
Yeah. Now, we should talk a little bit more about some results we're getting in. This is William Blow's results map looking at the Albury area. And we have Albury and Albury West have both reported, as well as Lavington. And again, we're paying attention to these areas because we expect that One Nation is winning the rural areas by quite large margins. And for Milthorpe to be at all competitive, she'd have to do very well in these booths, probably better, because they don't make up such a large part of the electorate. Albury, the booth of Albury, no other words attached, just the word Albury. It's a decent one for Milthorpe, 39.7%, but she's only up 5.7%. And bearing in mind that there would have been a decent Labor vote in this booth that has now vanished, 28% for One Nation. That's pretty respectable. And I think at that point, it's not just that rural voters are voting for One Nation, but they're becoming the main right-wing option that people would consider. Hume, we've already looked at. Glen Rowe, we've already looked at. And then we've got Albury West here. 42% for Milthorpe. That's probably one of her better booths. But that's only 0.1% up on last time. So actually, that's the result. People were talking before about, are we matching like with booths? She should be winning Albury West by a lot. And as you can see, it's very close to the electorate of Indi. This is the state border right here below. And Lavington as well. One Nation has actually topped the primary vote narrowly. in Lavington. So I think, we're still missing preference counts on a bunch of these booths, but I think the independent wins in Albury are not going to be overwhelming.
No, and they would need to be. I think not only at this point, it's not really about winning the election, but it is about sort of proving a model, or I suppose testing what this means going forward for these rising alternatives we're seeing to the Liberal and National Coalition. So where voters go as the party increasingly is not obviously representing regional voters. The Liberal Party is not representing a lot of urban voters these days either. So this has some really, really big ramifications for not just how grim this future is, but what form it actually ends up taking.
Absolutely. Now, another question for you. We've got the Teals in the cities, the community independents in the cities who've done pretty well. Goldstein, they lost, but they've been able to win Bradfield. In regional areas, though, and you do have people kind of trying to adapt that model, trying to run in those regional areas, getting funding. There was a bunch of these candidates who ran in 2025 for a second or even a third time, and they just haven't been able to cut through. They would get a respectable vote. They'd make it into the top two. They'd get well over 40% of the two candidate preferred vote, but none of them won. Apart from Helen Haynes, who's been there for a long time, and you could argue about Rebecca Sharkey, but no one new was winning. And Milthorpe is one of those. She was new in 2025, but I think it does reflect that it's relatively easy for them to scoop up 40% plus of the vote, get the progressive side of the electorate to vote for them, get a few Liberals or Nationals to switch over. But I think one of the things we might be taking away from Farah is that, One Nation has effectively supplanted the Liberals and the Nationals as the main right-wing option here. And other than that, it's looking kind of similar to when those regional independents put up respectable challenges but didn't come that close to winning in Cowper and Wannon and seats like that in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think you're probably right in this, that they are picking up from the more moderate side of Liberal voters who are flaking off, but that's not enough to present a real challenge. It's also not, as you say, going to become the right option. So One Nation is really fulfilling that role here. It is, I think, also like the geography that we're seeing here in Farah is probably a little bit indicative of what we've seen in other regional electorates in the last few elections, which is where independents tend to do quite well in these hubs, large towns, regional cities, but regional electorates are diverse, and they are diverse in a way that we don't see in the city. So you are appealing to people with very different interests, whether that's kind of material basic interests or what kind of policy concerns they have, or even just how they're feeling about the state of politics. So it's a much harder ask, I think, for these independents to do that. And it is, I have yet to fully, I think, wrap my head around why it is One Nation has done this. I don't think any of us perhaps have, but it is a really interesting development. And I think Farah is speaking to a pattern that we're seeing across regional electorates in Australia.
Yeah. Now, we might take a break, maybe in 10 minutes or so, a few minutes, and just take a break for a few minutes before the 8 o'clock hour, if that works for you, Phoebe, because I think we have a little bit less to talk about than maybe we thought we would have, and come back in a little bit once there's some more results. So we might just go through where we're at with all the figures at the moment, and then we will take a short break and then come back at 8 o'clock to go into more detail on what's been going on here. So yeah, as it stands at the moment, David Farley, One Nation's on 42% of the primary vote. That's off 58 booths. Now that is mostly rural, but we do have now, by my count, I think 6 booths in the Albury area that have reported primary vote figures, so it's not entirely rural. Milthorpe is clearly in second. The AEC seems to have made the right decision to do an independent versus One Nation count, which we were talking about earlier. The conventional wisdom that this was an independent One Nation race is looking quite credible at the moment. I won't say yet whether the polls were overstating Milthorpe, because I think Milthorpe's primary will go up a little bit more as the count goes on. But One Nation is clearly in a position where, you know, they have quite a lot of national and Liberal preferences they can gain. One thing that's of interest as we get more votes in is the preference flow calculations, which William's computer is doing for us. Now, this is just the booths where the 2 candidate preferred count has been reported, basically subtracting the One Nation preferences from the One Nation primary, the same for Millthorpe. And even though the pool of preferences is very right wing, you know, there's not much with the Greens, 2.4%, quite low. I think that will go up, but it's pretty low. Most of the rest are conservative, you know, shooters, fishers and farmers, family first, and of course the Nationals and the Liberals. And yet, those national Liberal voters are not preferencing One Nation by very strong margins. The Independent is doing quite respectably on those numbers. But, you know, One Nation's still in a strong enough position to be able to turn their primary vote lead into a preference win. So, yeah, that's where things are standing. Phoebe, was there any other thoughts you had? And then what we might do is we might take a break for a few minutes and then come back and talk a bit longer after 8 o'clock.
I think at this point, for a few thoughts, I'm very interested to see as we get more information on those preference flows, where, if at all, there are differences between national and Liberal votes and where they're going. I think that is quite an interesting thing to see in the campaign, is the Nationals and the Liberals have responded to One Nation differently. There has been a distinction in kind of how much they've viewed them as a challenge versus perhaps, you know, in the case of the Liberal Party, directed preferences towards them. And it would be interesting to see if this is reflected within the preference flows and where they end up.
Sure. All right. Well, we might pause there for a bit and then we will come back at 8 o'clock on the hour to update on where things are at. Thanks for joining the Tally Room live stream of the Farah by-election results. And Phoebe, you'll be back at 8 o'clock and we'll talk a bit longer then. So what we might do is we might turn our mics and cameras off now and we will be back at 8 o'clock. Thanks for watching. Hello and welcome back to the Tally Room live stream covering the Farrer federal by-election. Welcome back to the show. It's 8 p.m. I'm joined by Phoebe Heyman from La Trobe University, and we'll have Emily Foley from Canberra University and Flinders University joining us shortly as well. So we might just run through a little bit of where the latest figures are up to at 8 o'clock, and then we'll talk a bit more about the broader context of what's been going on as we wait for those pre-polls and postals to start to come in. I will share this screen here that shows, if you are interested in tracking the results, the William Bowes poll bludger website, where we're just going to be sharing that on the screen here. We're now at a point where we've got 49 booths reporting two candidate preferred counts. So it looks like most of the rural booths have reported. We've also got preference counts from Albury East and Albury North, which are showing comfortable victories for Michelle Milthorpe, but not overwhelming ones. In Albury East, she's winning 469 to 288, for example. One of the big stories here that we were wondering about was how the two different parts of the electorate would perform. And what we're seeing is that in the rural parts of the electorate, David Farley from One Nation is winning comfortably. In most booths, he's well over 60% of the two candidate preferred count. Whereas in Albury, we don't have quite as much of the results coming in, but at the moment, Michelle Milthorpe's leads in these booths are not quite as strong as what Farley is getting. For example, in Glenroy, she's winning 541 to 475, which is one of those kind of outer suburban Albury booths. So that's on a two candidate preferred basis. That's 53.3% for Michelle Milthorpe. So what that means is that Milthorpe isn't winning as comfortably in Albury as Farley is doing in the rural parts of the electorate, and the remainder of the electorate makes up about 70% of the population. So that is the reason why we were able to call this result so early at 7:29. Myself and William Bowe called the result for One Nation because of that lead in those rural areas. So unsurprisingly, as the Albury vote is coming in, the One Nation 2CP is dropping a little, but it's still pretty comfortable. It's at 60.2% at the moment. And, you know, it probably will end up under 60%. But bearing in mind that the last election, Susan Lee only got 56.2%. So right now it seems quite plausible, based on looking at some of these figures, comparing them to how Millthorpe did against Susan Lee last time, that the One Nation margin may end up being bigger than the previous Liberal margin. Now, Phoebe, I don't know if you can hear me, but clearly there's some technical issues there. But maybe you want to quit and come back. That might help there. And we've got people coming back. Thank you for that. And yeah, once we have our guests back, I think we're going to be talking about the role of money in this campaign, the role of the kind of accusations from both sides of outside spending that I think has played a big role in this campaign, and the broader political implications for the country, as this kind of is a confirmation of what we've been seeing in the national polls in terms of the losses of National and Liberal Party support to One Nation in rural and kind of regional areas. So I might pull up the map of the booths that William Bowe has generated, which is quite an interesting one to look at. And it follows a similar kind of methodology to my own election maps, where it has numbers to show how much each booth is being won by. And you can see here, One Nation, for example, if we go into this kind of Griffith Leeton area, which is the other major centre of the electorate apart from Albury, there's one booth there, 51% in the centre of Griffith, where Millthorpe is winning a majority, but in almost every booth, Farley is winning majority, often over 60%. Okay, so
I'm back and I brought Emily Foley with me to talk through the result with you, Ben.
Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining us. So just to reintroduce you for anyone who doesn't know, Phoebe Heyman and Emily Foley from I think La Trobe University and Canberra and Flinders University, respectively. Both political scientists who we've had on the podcast before. I'm really interested in your perspective on what either of you can jump in here. What this means, what this tells us about the state of Australian politics.
I'll let you start.
Let me start. I mean, it's pretty significant. I mean, there's a whole range of factors that are really interesting. Just really quickly before I launch into my little rant, Ben, are connections okay?
Yeah.
I think there's a whole bunch of elements. Obviously, what I found interesting in the last week is that we really barely talked about the Liberals in this, even though the loss for a seat of over 70 years held is extremely significant. In terms of the sort of broader implications, I mean, we have the first ever One Nation lower house seat in Parliament. I mean, that in and of itself is, within the current climate, is really interesting. But what I've been
it's worth clarifying for anyone who might wonder about that. Pauline Hanson was elected in 1996 with the name Liberal on the ballot, in practice as an independent, then formed the party, but was never re-elected in the lower house. Barnaby Joyce is obviously a One Nation lower house MP now, but again, not elected as a One Nation member. So this is the first time they've won a lower house seat at a federal election.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And thank you for the clarification, Ben. I think that one thing that I guess that I would like to maybe point out from the outset that I've been thinking about is, there's something about Farley who doesn't quite strike you as the classic One Nation candidate. Even, in particular, when you're talking about the electorate and you're talking about the fact that, there's a significant part of the electorate that need migrant labour. And so those kind of really classic One Nation indicators of the sort of radical right populism, anti-immigration rhetoric, you're really not seeing in this election and with this candidate. And there was almost, there was far more of a discussion around issues around water, health, and sort of the general kind of popular sentiment of the regions being overlooked. But those kind of classic One Nation indicators, you're not seeing as much. So all of that is kind of playing in my head at the moment. I don't know what you think, Phoebe.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think there is, obviously, the question has been raised about whether Farley stays a One Nation MP over time, whether that will continue to be the case. He obviously diverges from Hanson on a number of city issues. So will he fall in line? Will be a clash of personalities. This has historically been a recurring problem within Hanson's party. Is at the end of the day her party, and there's been some small signs of kind of a coalescing of a more party-like organisation, to use phrase, but it is still unclear whether or not there is space for other views, whether it will come together in this kind of more organised way as we move forward. I think, I think there's a lot of question around Farley himself as a figure, and it's an interesting point.
And this is something that has been a long-running story in the history of One Nation. Has been people getting elected and then defecting. They got 11 members elected in 1998 in the Queensland state election. None of them were members by the time of the next election. They had 3 One Nation upper house MPs in New South Wales a couple of years ago, and now they don't have any. It's kind of a recurring theme, and I guess one of the things we're going to be wondering about during this coming period is, has anything changed for the party? I think they have somewhat chosen more credible, serious candidates like Farley in the South Australian election. We saw a bit of that, although again, not entirely. I mean, the story that I find interesting is the candidate who worked as a hairdresser in a regional electorate and wasn't aware that the job involved having to travel to Adelaide quite a lot. And I think it does reflect that you get these people getting elected who maybe aren't the kind of typical politicians, which is also something I think a lot of the voters appreciate. But also the difficulty that Pauline Hanson has had working with others, quite frankly, and whether they can do anything to change that, whether this kind of new generation of influx of talent is able to work differently. But also it does sound like there's a bit of a story about Farley himself. There's stories about One Nation figures being worried that he might defect, which can sometimes become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You demonstrate your lack of faith in someone and they walk out the door. So, I think Farley would be quite a credible independent if he was to become an independent. And I think probably a lot of the people who voted for him would be perfectly happy with such an outcome.
Yeah, certainly. And I think on the issues where he has diverged from the party, he has done so under claims that he is doing it to represent his community better, that it's about representing Farah over One Nation interests. So yeah, there is absolutely an avenue for him there. I also think on the point around Hanson herself being quite a big personality, most parties have systems for dissent and disagreement and to hash out details between them. And One Nation, it seems, has never really developed these internal organisational structures. Whether they do so, whether they find other ways to kind of foster and develop this agreement, will perhaps I think be a key question going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would sort of add is, I mean, this is really the interesting element of this is when you're going to be talking about the contestations in lower house seats. So it's all well and good in sort of running for Senate positions to talk about the kind of broader issues within Australian society. But when you're talking about the sort of bread and butter issues in a really overlooked kind of regional electorate like Farah, we see the need to talk about issues that actually might come up at odds with some of the broader kind of narratives that One Nation opposing. Things, I mean, for me, the big thing is, and I've looked at migration in my PhD, but those topics about migration, the way in which Farley was talking about migration, they're really not typical One Nation talking points. So the extent to which those become at odds with each other eventually, I think Mark Ribaldi, our good friend and colleague, said it. I totally agree with what he said on your podcast, which is, I don't think the likelihoods are that high, based on track records and previous experiences, but you never know.
Yeah, so we'll talk about the broader implications, but we just want to give a bit of an update on the results. We're now at a point where we have over 60 of the booths have reported 2CP figures, whereas 70 have reported primary votes. So we're at a point now where the preference count is catching up on the primary vote. We don't have every booth in, but we've got the vast majority of them. And then we're waiting for those special votes. We actually are starting to get some of these small rural pre-poll booths have come in. We've got Baronga and Deniliquin, Moama, Morwala. I wanted to just dwell on the election day booths in Albury because we have 2 candidate preferred counts now. I think for all of them, I think there's 2 white dots there in the middle where we don't have any figures. One of them's Lavington East, and I'm not sure which one the other one is. But you know, Millthorpe is winning them all, but she's not winning them by very large margins. You know, in a bunch of these, she's getting 51%, 53, 54, 55. There's a couple in the 60s in that kind of inner city Albury, but she's not running up a very large majority. And to be honest, it doesn't look any more impressive than what she got in the same area in 2025. If I look up the same, effectively the same map, but for 2025 from the last election, where, you know, for the people who think it's unusual for an independent to be in orange, her booths were coloured in orange. And at that election, she had 6 booths where she cracked 60% of the 2 candidate preferred vote. And right now there are 3, maybe a 4th one, depending on what happens in one of those booths that haven't reported. So it does look like right now Millthorpe's position in Albury is actually weaker than it was last time, and she probably needed it to be a lot higher if it was going to offset this very strong vote for One Nation in the deeper, more rural parts of Farah. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it does. It looks like the preferences are not pointing to her perhaps as strongly as I think they would have hoped. She is generally slightly up on primaries, but it's very narrow. Like some of them, I'm looking at Albury West here, and it's 0.1% swing towards her in the first preference vote.
Yep.
It's next to nothing, which for the area in which she kind of put most of her campaigning eggs in that basket, I imagine there are a lot of very disappointed campaigners out there right now. It does also suggest that it's not just about the region. It's perhaps not just about water or disaffected farmers. This is kind of our regional hubs are saying very similar patterns.
Yeah. No, I agree completely. I mean, I think it's sort of, there was a few, I mean, I overheard you talking about it earlier. I think the orange v orange, there's all these sort of heuristic cues that I thought was just like made for a very confusing campaign. Clearly, something hasn't landed with Millthorpe. And yeah, I think it would be quite a disappointing result.
Yeah, I do also wonder.
One thing that you talked about earlier, Phoebe, which I wanted to address a little bit, was the idea that a lot of these regional independents, they do quite well in the regional centres, but they don't do well in the rural hinterlands around them. And that as these electorates have had to grow, they've had to expand to cover these vast areas. And so this is not an electorate of Albury. Like Albury is not insignificant part of the electorate, but a lot of these seats have had to spread to cover this larger area, and that's one of the things that probably would have changed if the parliament was expanded, was that would have allowed these seats to shrink a little bit and maybe would have had a different dynamic in some of these. You know, if there was an electorate of Albury, then I think Millthorpe would be the MP for it, but the vast size of Australian electorates means in these rural areas these voters are put together when they actually vote quite differently to each other.
Yeah, now they're getting bigger. But it is, I think, to be clear, I don't think it's necessarily always an issue of campaigning. I think part of it with independence is always an issue of just being known. And like David Farley himself is a bit of a character by all means, and whether that's worked for him or against him, I think is a pretty open question right now. But this idea that, you know, Michelle Millthorpe needs to explain to people on either end of an electorate who she is in the first place. One Nation, despite all of the baggage that the brand may come with at times, has a brand. It has a kind of set of, as you say, heuristics that voters know. They see Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party on a ballot paper and they understand roughly what that stands for and what it means. Independent is a broad label. Inherently, it is one where you have to explain to people who you are in some detail before you can then get about to like trying to persuade them to vote for you.
And I think you had, I mean, Labor didn't field a candidate. You had the Libs, the Nats, and One Nation really drilling in that Millthorpe is a teal in disguise, right? And so, I mean, I think what, cause and effect, obviously, we take with a grain of salt. What we can definitely hypothesize is that was a successful campaign in which, Millthorpe didn't quite take off in anywhere near the way that she would have hoped to.
Yes, something else I wanted to ask you two about before we move on as well was the role of money and the role of donations and outside influence in the electorate. I feel like we had a lot of accusations flying in both directions, and I want to pull up now the sign that was put up in the in the seat of Farah today that the AEC put out a statement about, specifically this sign that was authorised but not sufficiently authorised in terms of the precise information. Clearly, it's someone probably sympathetic to One Nation, but certainly opposed to Michelle Milthorpe, taking a snippet from donations registries, listing the amount of funds she's received from these like environment groups, and weirdly at the bottom saying plus 60,000 from GetUp, which I'm not sure what the exact story is there, because GetUp doesn't usually donate directly to these candidates. I would have assumed that GetUp would be spending its own money. And the AEC was concerned and was seeking legal advice around the possibility of taking action on this, specifically around the idea that this is being presented as something official. But while this is going on, we also have all the stories about One Nation, Gina Reinhart buying Pauline Hanson a plane. Clearly the party is in a very financially healthy position right now. And so we've kind of got these going in both directions.
Yeah, I mean, only to say, I agree with everything that you said, Ben. I mean, just like looking at this ad, I'd seen some sort of news articles, but I'd actually missed the image. But this is a belter of an image. I mean, it just clearly looks like AEC branding, doesn't it? All I saw that there was an injunction in the courts currently, but the role of money, in the sense of, I mean, I think at sort of at this point in time, there were exactly what you said. I don't think I have anything particularly intelligent to add on top of your comments, but there was money being thrown at either side. I think there was sort of significant media reporting about the plane, etc. But I think at the end of the day, what candidates were doing around that electorate were clearly focusing on, there was this, I guess, focus on Pauline Hanson was independent from what Farley was doing around his electorate, and potentially that was sort of what cut through a bit more with voters. I didn't see Farley too much engaging with a lot of those sorts of discussions. It was more focused on the leader, who, yes, was there, but really, I think Farley kind of took centre stage in the electorate. I don't know if you've got anything.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the one thing I would add is just to contextualise it, which is not to say that this wasn't. I don't think we usually see private jets handed out during by-elections, but there is usually additional spending and money that goes into by-elections because they often attract, particularly ones like this, a significant amount of attention. But they also happen at a time when there aren't 20 other electorates that are being focused upon. We see things like GetUp come in because they are not trying to contest other areas. So to my understanding, GetUp did not donate money, but they were somewhat active in the Farah by-election. To what degree they were on the ground or spending money, I'm not clear on, but they were present, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And, GetUp has been a bit quieter in the last couple of years than they were before, and they've been clearly trying to use it as an opportunity.
Coming back, Ben, have you noticed?
I have noticed, yeah.
They have been coming back a bit more, so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the lead up to the next election. Stay tuned for by Phoebe and Mark Ribaldi on the matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be looking forward to that. One of the issues they've always had, though, is that their message works in a particular kind of community, and they try to expand beyond that. But how effective it is a big question. Now, just to give an update on the results, we now have 67 booths reporting preference counts, 75 booths reporting primary votes. So we've got about 55,000 votes counted. We have most of the election day vote counted now, as well as some of the early vote. As we were looking at earlier, Milthorpe is winning across Albury, but not by enormous margins. We are starting to get pre-poll votes in, and Milthorpe is very clearly in second place. I mean, I'm looking here, for example, at the Deniliquin pre-poll booth, where Farley has about twice as many votes as Milthorpe, but Milthorpe still has more votes than the Liberals and the Nationals put together. So it's looking like a terrible night for the Liberals and the Nationals. That's something I think we can forget by really focusing on Milthorpe and One Nation and the competition between them. But this was a Liberal seat until a couple of months ago. Before that, it was a National Party seat. And right now, they are totally out of the game. And, it's not a shock considering the national polls, but I think sometimes it hits different when real people vote and you get a real result. I think there's probably a lot of people leaning to the left, although maybe also amongst Liberal Party supporters who are like, oh, One Nation's going to crash and burn. They won't be able to turn this into results or whatever. And, so far they have actually been able to translate, whether it's this or South Australia, translate these polling figures into actual victories.
And I mean, I think the last sort of significant for me by-election, I'm thinking of Wentworth, which, you know, there was Karen Phelps, which, you know, was seemed at that time, you know, even speaking, I was actually speaking to some nerdy pollsters and academic nerds like us, just regular people, and they were saying it's a protest vote. Today is a protest vote. You know, this by-election, what it is a protest vote. But actually, you know, with Wentworth and others, these sorts of by-elections, I think they do signal kind of broader swings and trends. So I think this is entirely we're political organisations scholars, so it all comes back to, I think, the capacity for One Nation to sustain itself long term, because I think this is an extremely significant kind of precedent in the contemporary era.
Yeah. No, I mean, people are obviously using the party as a vehicle to voice many things, probably chief amongst some disaffection, but whether the party can kind of follow through enough for them to stay with them longer term remains to be seen. I mean, these are voters who are likely disappointed, likely feeling not great about the available options. So it really, I think, will matter what happens from this point.
And I just think as well, just something, sorry, Ben, if you had something to add, but I think the Liberals performed very poorly in the campaign overall. I was chatting about this with Phoebe before, but the Barry Cassidy moderated candidates forum, in which Bukowski was asked about the how to votes and preferences going, Liberal preferences going towards One Nation. And the answer was so unsatisfactory that the entire room, I think probably a combination of One Nation and Millthorpe supporters, were all laughing. She just sort of said it was ease of preferences. Like, it just seemed like it was for a seat that had been held for so long by Susan Ley, who held such a number of significant ministerial roles, as well as leader of the opposition. Like, it felt like an incredibly underwhelming campaign.
It did, and didn't have the presence you would have thought of for something of this much prominence.
It's probably worth coming back. We're gonna re-talk about a few things as the night goes on, as we get fresh data, fresh information. I'm sure people are coming and going. You mentioned preferences. William's website is calculating how much of the preferences are flowing to One Nation or to the Independent, you know, of all the votes cast by everyone else. And, you know, there's about 32% of the vote here that's not with Millthorpe or One Nation, and about 21% is with the coalition candidates. So it's about 2/3 of the preference pool is coalition votes. And yet right now, the One Nation is only gaining about 51.4% of preferences. And, you know, most of the other votes are also right-wing. There's probably, if you count legalised cannabis, the Greens, maybe even Sustainable Australia, it's about 5% of the vote that's sort of other parties of the left. So you'd expect it to be quite right-wing, but I think it does probably reflect that the more conservative parts of the Liberal national base have defected to One Nation, and what's left is not particularly favourable. And it also doesn't really show, we'll get more precise figures in a few weeks, but we're not seeing a really strong trend of, you know, the Liberals put One Nation, and the Nationals put One Nation quite high on their how to vote card. It's not translating into really strong preferences to One Nation, which could be interesting when it comes to the next federal election about, you know, if the Liberals and One Nation aren't really exchanging preferences in a particularly tight way, that might make it easier for Labor to win more seats.
So I was just taking a quick look also at the previous Labor vote, which was around 15% in Farrer primary last time. And you just having to think about where that's wound up, because we are not seeing that, I think, reflected exclusively in Millthorpe's vote at this point. So yeah, that's obviously similarly kind of fragmented.
Well, she's up 7.2%. So that's like most of the Labor vote, but not all of it.
Not all, no, definitely not all. So I think, yeah.
Yeah, but also I think, and I can't take credit for this hot take, it's got to go to Josh Sundman. But I mean, the question is as well, what are the number of people who voted for Michelle Millthorpe in the last election that are not voting for her now, that are actually potentially voting for One Nation now? In the last election, it was Susan Ley against Millthorpe, right? And there was a very significant discontent with the coalition at that point in time, as we saw from the landslide. You know, there's a whole lot of up in the air questions, I think, at this point. I think it's not unlikely that there would be a number of former Millthorpe voters in the last federal election that are not voting for her again.
And you saw this, you saw this in the South Australian results, that you look at preference flows and, you know, you do have this strong polarisation where you've got One Nation Liberal on one side, you've got Labor and the Greens on the other. But Greens voters are a little bit more likely to defect to the right if they're up against One Nation than if they're up against the Liberals. Not a majority, but just a little bit stronger. Likewise, One Nation voters are just a little bit more open to the Greens than you might think that they are. And I do think there is an element with both parties. I think is probably also there with the people who voted for Millthorpe, maybe tonight, but certainly last year, who you know, they're not looking at things from a strict left-right spectrum perspective, but a lot of this is about insider-outsider perspective, and Susan Lee was very much an insider.
And who cares about the electorate? And who's going, you know, I think in this sense, and I'm not sure if you guys had spoken about this earlier, but from what we were discussing, there's sort of the tensions between being on the border of two different states and the sort of feeling not only of being regional, but being overlooked from a state government perspective as well. You know, you've got a lot of compounding factors within this area. So yeah, I don't think those, you know, for many people, those traditional left-right dimensions aren't really playing a factor into everyday lives of running a farm, running an agricultural business, issues around water politics. Yeah.
No, I think it is. If it is about insider-outsider politics, and it is about the kind of fragmentation of that right vote into these new vehicles, whatever they may be, there is a question about whether independents are the ones who give it up and One Nation, and who kind of better represents a protest, I think, at this point, in some ways. And I can see why One Nation would end up being the vehicle that voters are lined up with.
So we're coming to 8:30 now, and I just want to give a bit of a summary of where things are at. I'll just refresh this here. We now have 77 booths reporting primary votes and 73 reporting preference count. So the preference count is almost caught up on the election day on the primary vote. We are starting to get some small pre-poll booths in. Starting in Moama, pre-poll booth is a little bit bigger than the others. Deniliquin's quite large, but we're not getting any of the pre-polls from Albury yet. And it just looks at the moment like it's a comfortable victory for One Nation. They're currently on 58.2% after preferences, 42% before preferences. And so we'll see how it goes as that Albury pre-poll booths come in. But at the moment, the One Nation margin's a little bit bigger than what Susan Lee got at the last election. One other thing that William and I talked about in the last hour was postal votes, us not really knowing how they would flow compared to in a major party contest, because postal votes tend to be relatively conservative, but they also tend to favour the organised major parties. One Nation is on about 59% of the postal vote at the moment. So it basically reflects what's happening in the rest of the electorate. It's not particularly conservative compared to the rest of the electorate, but I suspect it will end up, One Nation will still do a bit better on the postals than you'd expect on election day. But pre-poll is a much bigger vote than the postal vote, so that's the bigger one that we'll be watching. That's the one that's really been growing in recent years. Now, do either of you have any other thoughts about what's going on here? Maybe we could talk briefly. The next big election we're expecting, we do have a small election next week. The Stafford by-election in Queensland is the Victorian state election in November, where, again, we are expecting One Nation to be quite strong and quite competitive. You're both based in Victoria. But I guess we don't really know how it's going to play out in a different dynamic where we have a Labor government that's a lot less popular than the Malinowskis government was in South Australia, a Liberal coalition that's maybe not peak strength but is not in the weak position that the South Australian Liberals were.
Oh, November's going to be very interesting, not just because we're from Melbourne and we say that it's going to be very interesting, but no, it's just, I think we've got, I don't know how you're feeling about it, but it's just a constant week by week bouncing back and forth about how I think it's going to go. If I'm perfectly honest with you, I think, yes, One Nation are going to do. I mean, the Labor Party are so deeply unpopular. I was in Adelaide the other month and just seeing posters of Peter Malinowskis's face posted all around Adelaide City. Like the idea of Jacinta Allen's face being posted on anything at the moment in the city. And particularly Labor heartlands as well, like in the outer west areas that feel extremely neglected by a very long period of Labor government. So we've got the It's Time factor combined with this sort of, rising popularity of One Nation, while at the same time, I think we see sprinkles of the Liberal Party kind of come into a potentially a credible opposition, and then it just sort of dissipates again. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think similar, but like Labor, obviously at this point, a government who has been in power for a very long period, and people are, it seems like, over it in many, many ways. But it's One Nation, I think, is well poised to do really well. The Liberal Party, while certainly not as weak and disorganised as we see in South Australia, is also not in a strong position, and the avenues for power there aren't clear, I think, in many ways. We are looking at things like disaffection in traditional Labor heartlands, and I can see in many ways that they might be easier places for One Nation to make inroads than it would be for the Liberal Party to do so. So there are a lot of areas that I think are quite ripe for a decent One Nation candidate.
If I can just add one thing, what my final kind of thought on this, I think what is sort of interesting is we're seeing the third party organisations or interest groups really starting to gear up. Now everyone's starting to gear up to it. And what I've been noticing, studying sort of centre-left parties and the union movement in particular, is the union movement really gearing up towards fighting One Nation rather than the Liberal Party. And so I think the sort of campaigning terrain is shifting in that respect. I don't think it's going to be put the Liberals last anymore. I think it's going to be fighting One Nation.
Now, we've got Kevin Bonham joining us now. Now, Emily and Phoebe, feel free to stick around. Up to you if you want to stick around or head off. But I wanted to plug that I know that we're going to have we lost Kevin. I'm sure he'll be back in a second. We're going to have a special edition of the Australian Journal of Political Science that, Emily, I think you've written for, and Phoebe, you're one of the editors of, about minor parties and independence. And I'm doing my final edits next week, and I feel like I'm going to have to find a place to fit in some of this stuff about South Australia and Farah in that final version of my article about preferences. But also, both of you are co-authors of the book Landslide as well, which I'm in. So people should check that out as well if they want to know more about the last federal election as well. So thank you both for coming on. Now, I was going to throw to Kevin, but we've lost Kevin for a minute, but I'm sure he'll be back.
I'll step out after this, but I did want to say in particular, which might be of interest to people in the coming issue, will be Emily Foley and Josh Summan have written a piece that kind of speaks to some of the dynamics that we're talking about with One Nation and Labor contests and the potential for those going forward. That I think, if you're trying to unpack what happened tonight, may be of interest to people. But thank you so much for having me, Ben, and I will leave you with Emily.
Well, I'll head off to. I'll let you two talk. Unless, wait, is Kevin still?
He'll be back. It's fine.
I'll hang around for a minute until Kevin comes back, and then I'll hand off.
Thanks again, Ben.
Cool. Yeah. So just to check in again at the state of the count, we're at 74 booths in. I might pull up the the booth map, but yeah, we have a lot of these smaller booths, smaller pre-poll booths in, but it's going to be a while. There's a particular booth in Albury, pre-poll booth, that I'm just going to check the numbers from the AEC, their estimates of how many people they expect to vote at the Albury PPVC. They are estimating 800, which is not as many as I was expecting. Lavington is the other one that's also in the Albury area. Again, only 500 expected there. So maybe not quite as big as I was expecting, but we're going to be waiting for a few of these pre-poll booths that might take a little while to come in.
Can I ask you a question, Ben?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. What's been your sort of surprise of the evening?
I think One Nation's winning more comfortably than I thought they were going to. I think I would have expected. I don't think I expected the Liberals to do quite as badly as they're doing. I know that the polls were expecting them to lose fairly comfortably, but they've held this seat for a quarter of a century. They have you know, with the Nationals held it for 70 years, I would have thought they would have at least put up a decent showing the way that they did in Nepean at the Victorian state election, at the Victorian by-election last week. Yeah. But no, that's where it's going. And Kevin, you're back, and we were just saying that I was a little bit surprised at the scale of the Liberal Party defeat, though I didn't expect it to be quite as bad as it's been. And quite frankly, it's looking a lot worse right now than what the UConn's poll was saying, although maybe the national vote is up a little bit, so the total coalition vote doesn't look that bad. But what's your take on where things are looking at this point in the night?
Yes, this is truly horrible for the Liberal Party. I mean, they're the official opposition, and oppositions are supposed to do well in by-elections. In this case, I think Labor's was very wise to set this one out, though it wasn't a difficult decision. And the anti-establishment fury is being turned on the coalition parties.
Yeah, and I mean it's turning out to be a little bit of a quieter night than we were expecting as well. So we might end up finishing not quite at 10:30, but a little bit early, maybe 9:30 or 10. But hopefully we'll get some more pre-poll votes before that. But what do you think about the fact that the preference flows to One Nation are not particularly strong? You know, we'll eventually get more precise preference flows that separate, say, Liberal voters from Greens voters, but most of the preferences are coming from parties of the right. And they're only very slightly favouring One Nation, despite the Liberals and the Nationals putting them well ahead of Michelle Milthorpe on their how to votes.
Yeah, I thought it would be stronger than this, and I mean, I can only suspect that One Nation has so hollowed out the right side of the coalition vote that what you're left with are mostly moderates and randoms, and preferences not breaking very strongly at all. There are some in that minor party list that will be breaking strongly to Milthorpe, so that may also be a factor, but it's not as strong as I would have thought it was.
So just to note that I'm going to leave the two brilliant sophologists to continue. I'm going to finish up my night. Thanks so much, Ben, for having us. You're doing a brilliant public service to all of us. We love watching it. All right.
Thanks, Emily. See you next time. Yeah, It has been interesting how it's played out as well. I don't know what point in the night. When in the night did you feel comfortable calling this result?
Well, when you and William called it, I thought that's not unreasonable. But I did check, double check everything as I usually do to say, am I absolutely sure? And really, the one that did it for me was, I think, Albury North. It's a booth that Milthorpe won in excess of 60-40 over Lee last time, and she was only winning in the 50s this time, and she needed to, in terms of matching those swings, and they do match up fairly well, she needed to be getting a substantial swing to her, not a swing against her, and once I saw that one, I thought, yeah, that's enough. I sort of looked early in the night, I looked at all...
Go ahead.
Yeah, early in the night, I looked at all kinds of different ways to protect the is everything working?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sound good.
Yeah. Early in the night, I looked at all kinds of different ways to project what was going on, because we know that the sort of just a uniform swing, primary vote swing from One Nation from last time isn't going to work. I looked at a range of different things. And they were all pretty quickly pointing in a very similar direction. I was looking at the swings, relationship between the One Nation vote last time and the swing, relationship between booth size last time and the swing, relationship between the 2CP last time and the 2CP this time. All those things are just all soon ended pointing up in the same direction, somewhere around 60-40.
Yeah, now I might step out for a second and just go say goodbye to my kid. Do you want to, Kevin, do you want to just tell us your thoughts on this rural-urban split between the Albury side and the rural side, and how much that's been a big factor in deciding this result?
Well, I guess it's largely mirroring the split that happened last time between booths that were good for Millthorpe against the Liberals and booths that were strong for the Liberals. Across seats, across the seat generally, we're seeing quite similar to candidate preferred numbers in a lot of booths. So it's just, to me, replicating a split that was already there to a large degree. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like maybe I've been flattening out what the rural parts of the seat are, because obviously there is variation. There's the other bigger towns. Clearly, Millthorpe didn't do quite as badly in the Griffith-Leeton area as she did in some of the deeper, more rural areas. But overall, that margin blew out so much for David Farley early in the night that it became difficult, particularly when Albury, like if Albury made up 50 or 60% of this seat, I think Millthorpe would be in a pretty respectable position. Now, I talked earlier to William about we are waiting for a lot of pre-poll booths. I assume Albury and Lavington in particular are the ones we're watching for. We've got a decent amount of postal votes in, almost 4,000, and I think that's, in fact, it's almost exactly 4,000. When you add in the informals, it's 3,998. So they presumably have aimed to count 4,000 postals. I think that's all the postals we're going to get tonight. They're splitting about 59-41 in favour of One Nation. Any thoughts on what's going on with these pre-polls and postals, and, you know, the fact that we have kind of expectations about how early votes might vary from election day and how much those are out the window when we've got a One Nation independent contest?
I'm not seeing anything wild in that regard. At the moment, the swing in the pre-polls that have been counted so far to One Nation is higher than in the other vote types, but that's because of the mix of pre-polls that have been counted. There have been cases in the past where One Nation does badly on some kinds of votes in the post count, but that's like in general elections where there's absent votes. One Nation will sometimes do terribly on absent votes, but that's not an issue here. So it seems, I guess, in terms of postals, you get some flow on from the conservative types of voters who tend to vote by post. Some of them will vote for One Nation, and some of them will vote for the Liberals and preference One Nation. I don't think One Nation's advantage is strong on these kinds of votes, just thinking of what we saw in the South Australian election, but it's not like they do disastrously on them either.
Yeah, and I mean, looking a bit more broadly, you know, we've got a bunch of opinion polls now that have been telling us the same story, right? Which is that One Nation is in the top two. I'm just pulling up the latest polling to have a look at what the exact numbers are, but One Nation is well ahead of the coalition, not that far behind Labor. You know, in the recent polls, it's been pretty stable for the last couple of months, but they're in the mid 20s. I do wonder. I think there's been an expectation that maybe something would happen that would bring One Nation back down to earth. Whereas what we're seeing here, I think, is that in circumstances where the coalition is weakened, maybe where they have a sitting MP retiring, they are in a particularly weak position and are vulnerable to getting devastated in a lot of these rural seats. And so even though One Nation's vote, you know, there's still Liberals, the coalition is still polling over 20%. I think figures like this could play out to devastate them in a lot of the remaining coalition seats.
Yes, some people have not wanted to believe that this One Nation polling is real. South Australia showed that it was fully real. This is completely consistent with it being real, although, you know, we can't ever read too much into one by-election. There's always local issues at play, and this has been a rather weird campaign in terms of the personality of David Farley and his past associations, and the possibility that some voters are actually seeing him as more like an independent, more like a Helen Dalton type. and so he may have even benefited from some of the publicity showing that he was all over the place. But One Nation can obviously get votes, and I think that there's been a fair bit of denial about this. I noticed in the South Australian election, a lot of pretty bright people I saw saying One Nation are going to get 0 seats. And similarly in this, there were a lot of people continuing to think that Millthorpe would win the seat.
Yeah.
Just checking that I'm still coming through. I'm getting a message on my screen saying trying to reconnect, make sure you have a stable connection.
I don't know what that's about. You sound okay. I think it might be that the app tries to record what you're broadcasting for later, but we're not going to use that, so I wouldn't worry about that. I think at this point, the idea that One Nation won't win any seats at the next election, unless there's dramatic shifts in fortunes. I mean, one thing I'm curious about is, we've already seen the coalition change leadership, right? There's a new Liberal leader, there's a new National Party leader. I think both of those, at least in part, reflect a response to One Nation, a response to the coalition being more worried about threats to its right. This by-election was triggered by Susan Lee retiring. I wonder if this will also cause problems for Angus Taylor, because I don't think he's come out of it looking great, but I think you could also make a case that this was a pre-existing problem for the coalition, a by-election that his predecessor triggered at a very inconvenient time, and it's not his fault.
Yeah, I think there could be in this something of a Susan Lee loyalist factor as well. There could be that voters who likely may have not wanted to reward the Liberals after she was rolled as leader, and may have switched to Millthorpe or One Nation in protest against the departing MP's party. So that's another possible factor in how terribly the Liberals have done here. It is. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's Angus Taylor's fault, apart from him wanting the leadership, but it's at least saying that the change in leadership has not stopped the rot. We are still sitting in polling to where they were at the start of the year.
Sorry about that. We seem to have lost Kevin. Those technical problems seem to have gotten a little bit worse, presumably the internet connection. Just messaging him. But I might actually talk a little bit myself about, someone here saying Angus Taylor has to move right to survive. It is interesting that the coalition came out of the last election having been devastated on their more moderate side. They were wiped out in the cities. And I think it would have been very logical to say, the party needs to move to the centre, needs to address those voters. And they didn't even really have a chance to do it. Susan Lee becomes leader. I don't think she really, beyond the fact of choosing a woman to be leader, made a lot of changes to the way that the party was moving. And yet they already had a collapse on their right. But I think they're at a point now where the crisis is much more severe on the right than it is on the left. That, the right means that they're out of government, but their problems on their left mean that they're out of government, but the problems on their right causes the danger that the party would have an existential crisis and be wiped out of Parliament. And so I think that does explain why I think we will continue to see, when they have to pick a side, they're going to pick One Nation, because they're trying to signal to those voters, we want to work with you, we want to hold things together. And, I don't know how much further Angus Taylor can go. I did see some commentary the other day from a Liberal MP kind of saying, look, when we do stuff to the right, One Nation gets credit for it anyway. And I think they are in a bit of a situation now where people kind of don't like them regardless of what they do. Now, just to refresh where we're at, we probably will not be running quite as late as I was expecting. We now have the pre-poll preference counts from Moama, which leaned very heavily towards Farley, One Nation. He's on almost 70% of the formal vote there, and Deniliquin, which is about voting about two thirds for Farley after preferences. We have in fact, we have all but one election day booth has now reported its preference count. So the election day vote is almost finished now. And really, we are just waiting on these larger pre-poll booths. And those booths are Albury, Baruga, Corowa, Griffith, Lavington, Leeton, Narandra, and the EAV, which is the sort of telephone voting. It's not a very large booth as well. So I think we're getting close to the remaining count. There are some big parcels of votes to go, so we might wait a little bit longer to check those out. But really, at this point, the story is pretty clear. One Nation has won this by-election, probably with a bigger margin than Susan Lee had at the last election. Right now, they're on a 9.5% margin. I think that will drop back a bit as the more urban pre-poll booths come in, but that's the position. One Nation's on 42%, Millthorpe's on 26%, which is a bigger lead than what the UCom's seat polls were showing, which showed, One Nation slightly ahead of Millthorpe. The Liberals are polling more than the Nationals, but have collapsed in support. They are polling 11.5%, 21% total for the two coalition parties. So that's about half of the primary vote that Susan Lee polled at the last election. So this has been a devastating collapse in support for the coalition. Not just the Liberal Party, but there's been not much of an interest in switching from the Liberals to the Nationals. Yeah, so that's kind of the state of things at the moment. Like I said, I appreciate everyone coming on. This is the first live stream we've done for a by-election. We're not going to be doing these for every by-election because, as you can see, there's often a lot less results to talk about for by-elections, and so we end up having to spend a bit more time talking about the political issues and the broader interests. And really, we want these live streams to be focused particularly on the results and analysing them as they come in. But this has been such a big by-election that people have been interested in that we thought we would do it. Next week, there will be the Stafford by-election in Queensland, which is looking like a much more conventional Labor-Liberal contest. I will be live blogging that on the website, but that will just be a text-based when there's stuff to report, and the rest of the time I'll be going back to the normal Saturday evening routine. And also, if you're interested, on Monday, I'm going to be in Canberra for our live recording of the Democracy Sausage podcast hosted by Mark Kenny, Maria Taflaga, with Jill Shepherd, friend of the podcast, as well as another guest. And that's a free event, but you've got to register if you want to attend. So that'll be at the ANU, and I'm hoping we get a good turnout there. Like we wondered if maybe this result was going to be undecided. I've got a tentative booking with the AEC on Wednesday to discuss the results and the counting process if things were close, but I don't think there'll be that much to discuss. But I think even though this result hasn't proved to be super close, it's remarkable and significant and probably a topic of conversation to have the night before the federal budget of the state of the coalition. And, is there anything they can do? I mean, in my history of watching elections, sometimes you get to a point in an election position. I think of Labor in New South Wales in 2011, in Queensland in 2012, where it doesn't really matter what you do. Voters have kind of locked in and made the decision. But those were reducing a party to being a relatively weak opposition that they can rebuild from. Whereas I think if the coalition suffers the kind of result that they've seen tonight, there's not really going to be much to rebuild. And that is really quite remarkable to see. Now, I did have a couple of interesting questions for Kevin, but we won't be able to get to that. We have, of course, this is the third of 4 by-elections we've had over the last few weeks. We had what was a really interesting council by-election for the city of Newcastle, where they needed a new Lord Mayor, and by-election for a seat on the city of Liverpool the week before Anzac Day, and that one at those elections, we saw Labor retain a seat on the City of Liverpool Council, where the Liberals have been quite dominant on that council, but we also saw a remarkably devastating defeat for Labor for the Lord Mayor of Newcastle as well. So again, this trend of the major parties being weak and being vulnerable to minor parties and independents keeps coming up in a bunch of different contexts. Different people, different ideological positions, but wherever you go, I mean, I think there's a thing at the moment for major parties that even when they're in a relatively popular position, you think of people like Chris Minns or Anthony Albanese, they might have wide support, but they have shallow support. And I think, and then that does leave them vulnerable, that Labor, when they're in a weak position, can have those kind of results that we saw in Newcastle. And then last week, we also had the seat of Nepean, the Victorian state seat, which produced a result where the Liberals ended up holding on. One Nation polled about 25% of the vote. But that is also an interesting precursor for the Victorian state election, because it's not a particularly good area for One Nation, and yet they already polled a quarter of the vote. And we're also going to hopefully ask Kevin about the Tasmanian Upper House as well, where we saw an interesting result in the seat of Huon that covers the kind of rural areas to the west of Hobart, where and so the southwest of Hobart, where Dean Harris, who is a Liberal-leaning independent, has held that seat for a while. His father held it before him. He lost to Claire Glade Wright, who I think you could probably describe as a teal, kind of that sort of slightly centre-left independent. So that's not a good result for the kind of rickety Liberal minority government in Tasmania, that Harris was a loyal supporter, and they've lost him. And we've got Kevin coming back now. Hello, Kevin.
I don't know why it's not working. I don't know. Hello. Yeah, nothing's working. I don't know why it's not working. So I'm not sure if I'm here for a long time or a good time. We'll see how we go.
That's totally fine. I was going to ask you. There was a question from someone. We can just chat for a little bit, and I think we're getting close to the end of the evening here. Just while we wait to see if any more pre-poll votes come in, there was a question from Musgrob, who's a kind of an active participant in the Discord for the Tally Room, about this. Interested in your thoughts. I was just mentioning the results in Huon in the Tasmanian Upper House election, where we kind of had a bit of a teal replacing a Conservative independent. What's the Tasmanian Upper House now looking like?
So it's one independent replacing another, but that's a move back towards the left side in terms of the nature of the independents that are there. It's kind of a weird place to talk about, because the Labor Party votes with the Liberal Party so much of the time. So you don't have a traditional sort of government versus opposition dynamic where the government has sort of so many right-wing people on its side on votes, and the Labor has so many left-wing people on its side. You get that occasionally, but we're getting just as many of these votes where it's the government plus Labor, the two major parties, trying to see if they can get enough independents on side to counter out the fact that the independents have the majority. So it's rather strange on the floor of the House a lot of the time, but it is interesting for this upcoming vote on, if it does come to the floor, on banning greyhound racing, which is one where the major parties are on opposite sides.
Yeah. And finally, and we might just do this and then wrap up the results, your thoughts on what sort of seats we should be watching, maybe particularly outside of the typical deep rural seats, we should be watching for as ones that are kind of key One Nation prospects. And do you think there's any in Tassie to watch for?
Yeah, Braddon. Braddon is very One Nation-y. That does now have a Labor incumbent with a large margin, but that's one seat where One Nation can do well, definitely. And sort of a lot of the strength of the One Nation vote in Tasmania over the years has been suppressed by the Lambie network, and that's going to disappear. So it's going to be a lot easier for One Nation to to do well in Tasmania, to do well in the Senate at least, and to win the seats in state parliament if they manage to stay at their anything like their current high. But it's really the north of Tasmania is good for One Nation demographically.
Braddon's an interesting example because that's a seat where Labor has won. That's actually a Labor-held seat, but it's quite swingy. One theory I've had about as the multi-party system has been developing is that often in a lot of these seats, you end up with a candidate of the left bloc and a candidate of the right bloc. And the parties don't really self-identify as being part of those. But when you look at how preferences flow, when you look at how voter trends, which voters are willing to defect to someone more viable as opposed to sticking to their guns because they don't like that person. Labor and Greens voters are usually willing to defect and vote for one of these independents. And so Millthorpe is kind of part of that broader left bloc, and Farley's part of that broader right bloc. That until 2025, we'd mostly seen it on the left, that almost like we had like locally adapted versions of your centre-left candidate. So in areas where Labor's not the best party to represent the centre-left, someone else emerges and becomes the main one. Occasionally it's the Greens, but it's often more likely to be an independent. And now I think we saw it in South Australia that, the right was very weak in South Australia, so they didn't win many seats. But I could imagine a future where in mid-suburban Adelaide and inner Adelaide, the Liberal Party is the local right-wing party. And in outer suburban and rural areas, or maybe rural areas, they'll probably compete with each other. But in kind of those outer suburban areas, One Nation plays that role. And I could imagine Braddon being the kind of place where One Nation is the local adaptation of the right, effectively.
Yeah, that could be the case because I think that there are, what we saw in some parts of South Australia, particularly northern Adelaide, we saw in the state election that One Nation was competitive in seats, so the Liberal Party would never win in a million years. They were taking votes from Labor in seats of a certain demographic quite effectively, just not quite enough to win any of them. And Braddon is a place where that sort of thing could happen. So that is one to watch for. Sort of when Labor wins. Labor did spectacularly well in Braddon at the last election, but it's not. It's partly on displeasure with the nature of the Liberal campaign. The Liberal campaign in Tasmania was seen as terrible, as brought in a box from interstate, and Labor were very good at targeting local issues. Sort of putting up signs saying we will put a clinic in place X. And the Liberals didn't even have that sort of messaging at all. So that was part of what was going on there. But yeah, I think that somewhere like Braddon is going to be interesting if the One Nation surge persists.
Yeah, I'm just hoping to pull up my election map in a minute, and I'm just debugging a little bit of it because I think we're getting pretty close to finishing the night here. The preference count has fully caught up on the election day count now. We have these four smaller, two of them are Deniliquin and Moama are 3,000 votes each roughly. So they're not tiny, but we've got 4 pre-poll booths that have reported, another 6 that haven't. The EAV booth is kind of something different, 7 actually. But we're getting a pretty clear picture of, I think we're getting to the point where probably later tonight, around 10:30 or 11 o'clock, I think we'll get those other pre-poll booths in. But we're not going to stick around and chat the whole time. But I might just bring up a map which I will post up once I can find it. There it is. I will post it on the blog post later tonight, and if there's any updates, I might do a text update later tonight. Sorry, just correcting something here. But yeah, are you is there anything you're watching for with those last couple of booths coming in?
Just as on the point of on thing about the overall picture, something that I've noticed is the very poor showing by the Greens. I suspect that a lot of their votes have gone to Millthorpe, but is, I mean, they're lost their deposits and they're struggling to beat legalised candidates who haven't done particularly great themselves. So the sort of the general lack of interest in anyone outside the top four at this by-election, and that's even though the Liberals have done so terribly and shed so many votes, it hasn't been picked up across the field. All of the all of the minor candidates have polled below 3%.
Yeah, it's a very poor showing by those, which again makes the primary vote swing to Millthorpe appear like less favourable than you might otherwise think, because it's not just that she's lost the Labor vote, but she's also the Greens vote is halved as well. Yeah, okay, I think I will have this map up in a second and we'll run through that. So it's going to be mostly looking at the primary vote, actually. No, it's not working. Never mind. What I will do is I'll pull up Poll Bludger's map as well. So you can look this up as well yourself if you go to the Poll Bludger and look at his results website. But we can see here, this is a 2CP, 2 candidate preferred count. And, it looks like in these big rural booths along here, along the coast, along the Murray River, David Farley is clearing 70%. You've got this cluster of booths up here at the top where we got high 60s, low 70s, kind of right across the river from Mildura. He's doing, Millthorpe does a little bit better around Griffith and Leeton, which are a little bit more urban, but still Farley has won all but 2 booths in this area. He's winning in the the 50s in the Leeton area. So not quite as dominant as in those more rural areas, but still pretty comfortable. You've also got down here, you got Deniliquin, which is one of these booths, one of these areas where, Farley again is polling clear majorities, just, one of them, it's 54%, it's not huge. There is a booth there that's 89% near Blighty. And, I think that's a pre-poll booth, the one that's in bold there, the 66. And then we have the town of Albury, which there is one booth, Springdale Heights, I think it might be, where Farley has narrowly pipped Millthorpe after preferences. But Millthorpe is winning these booths, but this is really the story here, is that she probably needed to be winning 70, 80% in those booths to be of interest, right? Because it's a relatively small part of the electorate. If she could be winning Griffith, Leeton, doing a bit better in Albury, then we'd be looking at a much closer result here. But that's the story of the night, is, Millthorpe is roughly steady, probably down a little bit compared to the last election. That One Nation are very clearly the winners of this election. It's not close. It's not going to be something that's going to be something we work out over the next few weeks. It's very clear.
Yeah, the seat is too rural and not enough town for Millthorpe. But it's also the scale to which the One Nation is thumping the coalition in those rural booths. I mean, I don't know what a One Nation versus coalition 2CP in this seat would look like, but it would be something horrendous. And there's plenty of other seats you can translate that to, the outback seats particularly, that will look like a real worry for the coalition on these sorts of numbers. Noting again, sort of special factors, local candidates, all that sort of unusual candidate, all that sort of stuff. It's just it is difficult for an independent to win this sort of seat, and I think just in these circumstances, if you're going to use a by-election to send a message about local issues that you're unhappy about, be it water or whatever, it's like, is there any point in? I think a lot of voters would have seen that voting for One Nation was the way to say we're not. We want to kick over the can. I don't think that that voting for Millthorpe would have kicked over the can enough for them. And I think probably also there was a lot said about sort of she's just a climate 200 candidate, she's just a teal kind of stuff. Which she tried to get away from, but I don't think very successfully.
Yeah, no, I always thought the colour thing was a bit silly, but I don't think you can deny that the particular political position that she was coming from. And okay, so we're going to leave it there. It's 9:12. I think we will get some more figures later tonight, which will clarify things. We'll get some more data over the coming days. But David Farley of One Nation has won clearly. At the moment, it looks likely that he's going to have a larger margin than Susan Lee did in 2025. The Liberal vote has crashed. They've almost fallen behind the Nationals. I think they probably will stay ahead of the Nationals in the preference distribution, but they are a distant third place. And this is a very clear One Nation's first ever victory for a lower house seat at a federal election. And we're going to leave it there. Thank you for joining me, Kevin. Thank you to Emily and Phoebe and William, who joined earlier. We will be back with the podcast at some point. We're going to take a bit of a break over the next little while, but the podcast will definitely be back. I'll be in Canberra on Monday as part of Democracy Sausage, so check that out. And we will definitely be back with a live stream for the Victorian state election in November. So please join me for that. And until then, thanks and good night.
Good night.